Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Turner. I'm a strategist here at BBK, a global leader in clinical trial patient recruitment. It's a pleasure to return to host another important discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're excited to kick off another episode of Pharma 15 Live, exploring the relationship between health disparities and efforts to advance health equity for underserved communities in clinical research. Joining me today are three exceptional panelists to help explore the perspectives and challenges of underserved communities in clinical research and how sponsors or CROs can adapt to increase access to their trials and make them more inclusive. First, we have Judy Galindo, the Executive Director of the Sun Valley Research Center and a co-founder of Latinos in Clinical Research. Thank you for being here. We also have Rashaki Furness, a project manager in enterprise oncology and an active member and supporter from Black Women in Clinical Research. And we're excited to feature President and CEO of the Black Hills Center for American Indian Health and a principal investigator for the American Indian Clinical Trials Research Network, Dr. Jeffrey Henderson. Thank you all for being here. We're eager to hear your experiences and insights on this vital topic. I would like to take a few minutes for you each to introduce yourselves and your organizations before we get into the questions. And Judy, if we could start with you.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I've been in clinical research for 18 years. I started working as a research assistant for a sleep disorders company and then moved my way up. About 16 years ago, I had the opportunity to be a co-owner of a site in Imperial County. So that's what I've been doing the past 16 years. A few years ago, I also partnered with several other colleagues in the industry to create Latinos in clinical research because of all the work we do currently in the community I'm in. It's a large Latino community. I'm very passionate about ensuring we have more participants in clinical trials of all communities, but especially the one I'm working in. So that was a reason for creating Latinos in clinical research. There's a lot of barriers we still encounter to this day that we're going to be talking about. And that's currently what I'm doing at this time.
Thanks, Michael. My name is Rashaki Furness, as Michael already stated, and I am a project manager in the Enterprise Oncology Business Unit at a contract research organization. I have experience in pre and post clinical trial management and coordination, clinical trial and clinical lab operations, as well as a lot of volunteer work in clinical research and just trying to, be a health equity champion and promote diversity in clinical trials and clinical research.
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm Jeffrey Henderson. I am an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, one of the 9 Sioux tribes located here in the state of South Dakota. In 1998, I founded the Black Hills Center for American Indian Health, a community-based, tax-exempt, research-intensive organization, which has been ongoing, and through which we stood up a brand new clinical trial research site here in Rapid City through the COVID Prevention Network. And it's been a very enjoyable ride, and we're very happy to speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion in industry-sponsored clinical trials.
Very excited to have all three of you here. Thank you so much for both your commitment to this cause and to the people in your community. And so my first question, opening it up to everyone, is why is a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trial recruitment important for your specific communities?
Yeah, I don't mind going first. So as I mentioned before, we are located Sun Valley Research Center in a large Latino community. We have 75% Latinos in our community. So majority of the patients we recruit in our clinical trials are Latinos. They're English or Spanish bilingual. So it's extremely important to bring these clinical trial opportunities to our community for patients to have the options to participate. There is being in a small rural community, a border town into Mexico, There are limited resources, limited places you can go for like mental health services for other conditions. So clinical trials is another option. It is an opportunity. Aside from that, we need to know if these medications are working on all the patients that are being prescribed these medications. And I want to see patients in my community participate in the trials. I want to see them contribute to research, because in the future, when these medications are approved, they're coming back to my communities and being prescribed to the patients. So it's important that the providers, physicians in my communities have that information. They know if these medications are going to work. And if they're not, then they look at, the different options they have to ensure they can treat patients, alleviate some of the symptoms that, all these patients have in the various conditions. So that's why it's extremely important to me. I've been doing it for 16 years. Prior to that, my other research center, I was the only bilingual research staff they had there for a while. So I was the only one that would work with Spanish-speaking patients. Currently on my site, all my staff is bilingual. Our raters, our physicians, research assistants, recruiters, you have to be in the community we're in. And so that's something, we've learned a lot over the 16 years that I can share with other communities, especially Latino communities, and how we can do better to recruit participants, to educate community, to get more providers involved in research and more clinics, and be able to, have more recruitment in our trials, which is something that we need.
I'll take a stab at that question next. So some of the disparities in my community are very similar to those in Judy's community. But I think an added barrier for the Black community specifically would be the mistrust that is already there. And so just more diversity would come from first kind of breaking down that barrier of mistrust, so that we can participate more in clinical trials. I agree that there needs to be more awareness, which comes from, different perspectives of messaging, being more diverse in that regard. But also, I'm in a rural area here in Durham, North Carolina, and access is also another disparity, and just access to different resources to participate in clinical trials. So I would just summarize that by saying, I'm very passionate about it in my community specifically because we have some very specific barriers that need to be addressed.
I can certainly amplify those two responses. In my case, I've been a primary care physician for the Indian Health Service for 7.5 years. And not infrequently, when I wanted to start one of my patients on a new medication, they asked me, has this been tested in us yet? How can I know that this is going to work? And, at that time, no, this hasn't been tested in us. And I can only assume that we're not so unlike in a human way, others who did participate in those clinical trials for instance, metformin, let's just say metformin. But I couldn't, I couldn't know for sure. And so it is important. It's grateful to see the turnout that our new trial site has met with, and several of my participants have said, this is wonderful. This is the first time we are going to be part of the testing of this new, in our case, vaccine. And you can learn, about its effectiveness in us. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find that it is, really well tailored for us. So, yeah, that's a very, very important topic.
So, in your experiences, what would be some cultural barriers or factors that sponsors or CROs should consider when attempting to engage your communities in clinical trials?
Yeah, in my community specifically, the language barrier. So definitely the language barrier. We need materials in Spanish. That's a given, something I request from the beginning. I think we also need to understand that each community has different, the religious factors. There are certain things they don't celebrate. There's certain days that they have off. So like when you're designing ads, there's specific colors, there's specific images you shouldn't use, there's specific language you need to be careful with using. Those are all specific details that I think sometimes are not always considered. But that also goes to, the some of the barriers, cultural barriers. Those are some of the typical things I think I would say in my community that I've noticed on clinical trials and what we do. And I think those are the two that stand out the most right now.
And I would say for my community, it would definitely be, again, the mistrust. We have examples, unfortunately, such as the Tuskegee experiment. That's the one that's probably most well known. I try and promote within my community, bringing awareness that, at least those unfortunate events were not in vain, that there have been, laws and regulations that have been created surrounding that because of those unfortunate past experiences. So I think, honestly, from an industry perspective with CROs and other sponsors, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. You have to be honest about the mistrust in order to begin to break down that barrier specifically. No one in the community wants you to come in and say, we've addressed that. It's not an issue anymore. You're not going to build trust within the community that way. So I think, again, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, having those conversations and building the relationships first before attempting to even start a clinical trial or obtain, clinical trial participants, making sure those relationships are built prior.
And I can speak to your question, Michael, with a capital C in cultural. My Lakota Sioux relatives exist on quite a spectrum between being quite progressive or very traditional. And in the Lakota Sioux culture, we are not to break our skin intentionally outside of certain ceremonies. And so that has had a bearing on several potentially trial participants that I have consented, who deemed it not appropriate to participate in this trial with blood draws. This also has a bearing on how people feel when they're asked to apply their initials to the future research with their, remaining blood samples. We're probably running about 60-40 right now among my Lakota Sioux relative participants who are being asked to give their consent for future research with their blood samples. Some are willing to do that with few or no questions, but quite a few that really gives them pause and that really makes them wonder. And it's good when I can tell them, well, this would only be with respect to future SARS-CoV-2 research, not research spanning the whole spectrum of research. So if it can be tied down, they're more likely to sign off on that, or if that consent request is left pretty wide open, they would take a much closer look at that.
I really think all those responses really get to kind of the heart of what it is that's important about this discussion. And it leads to two really important questions. The first of which I want to ask is about setting up the infrastructure and actually getting on the ground level to start building relationships with your communities, as Rashaki mentioned. So what are some resources or steps that sponsors or CROs can tap into to begin building those connections that are necessary to make people comfortable and begin incorporating diversity and inclusion into their trials more effectively?
So, just like sugar, honey, iced tea rolls downhill, so does success. I am very involved in the employee resource groups at my organization. I think these are extremely important because they provide a sense of belonging for employees, and they also empower employees to have a voice, to share their perspective. And when it's done at a CRO level, such as, I'm a part of a CRO, you're approaching this systemic issue from multifaceted approaches, because you have employees in regulatory, you have employees boots on the ground at the sites, you have phlebotomists frontline, the folks who may be telling individuals about clinical trials, and then again you have your upper level management. That messaging, our CEO does a really good job of being committed to that messaging going across the industry of how important diversity, equity, and inclusion are. And it's a consistent messaging, it's diverse messaging, and again, it has to come from the top down. Just like the reason we need to be participants in clinical trials is because if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're on the menu. And I got that quote. I did not make that up. I got that from former U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams at the Black Women in Clinical Research inaugural conference earlier this year. But I definitely feel like sponsors and CROs specifically, they play a major part in empowering employees and just the individuals that work for them to be more diverse in their perspective and their approaches by communicating effectively the importance of it.
Yeah, and I wanted to piggyback off that because that's extremely important. Because of that setup that they have, they're able to work well with the sites who are open, thinking outside of the box ideas to recruit participants in their community. They're open to what the sites are proposing, because who's the one that's recruiting these participants? It's the sites, it's the site staff. And if we don't have that working relationship with a sponsor or CRO, and they're not open to what we're suggesting, what we know is going to work in our community, then we're not going to recruit these participants effectively. And so there's a lot of sponsor CROs that have been very open, very willing to do what we need to do. And then there's others that have not. So that's some of the barriers I've encountered at the site level. And especially when you're working on protocols with very challenging criteria, for example, mental health conditions, very strict criteria that even though I have a large database of depression patients, it gets narrowed down to like a few, then we have to think of other ways to get these patients in our communities. And they might be outside of the box ideas that are not typical of a lot of sites, but these smaller rural communities, this is what works. So it's a combination of various efforts, being in the community, connecting with physicians, talking to patients, probably a combination of social media ads on top of it. And it's multiple conversations we're having with patients, from in person to over the phone to getting them here before they even consider being part of a screening visit. And I think that's what sponsors and CROs need to understand. And many do, but many don't really understand all that work that goes into it. And so I think sometimes they just want to rely on what they used to do, for example, like a central recruitment campaign, and expect that's going to work across the board. But all sites are different. So you need to have a customized approach across all sites.
This is a good discussion. Yes, as the new kid on the block with a new start trial site that's just several years old, we have yet to reach our break-even point. And so what could sponsors do? We don't really need help recruiting more Lakota Sioux participants. That seems to come to us naturally because of who we are. But for instance, a $1,500 proposed startup fee. I mean, are you trying to insult me? No, I'm doing a new budget right now for a new trial. That startup fee is going up to $10,000, and they could do a much better job, providing us with the financial resources we need to do what's necessary, to further advance, diversify. Well, we really don't need diversifying. We're already 88% Lakota Sioux among my vaccine trial participants. But yeah, also some trials require sites to be able to produce peripheral blood mononucleocytes, or PBMCs. Well, my lab has never done that before. In fact, no lab in Western South Dakota does that. And so I've held out to the CROs in 3 different cases. I've said, well, we don't do that. We're not equipped to do that, but we would love to learn. Send somebody out and train us, and we'll be glad to gain that skill set among my lab techs. No one's taken us up on that yet. So yeah, there's things that sponsors could do to help us advance their desire to diversify their trial site populations.
Jeff, I hear you saying, put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I wanted to add something to that, what Dr. Henderson was mentioning. One of the things that I've struggled with at our site is recruitment plans. So we have funds approved, but then it's a pain to get these recruitment plans approved, or it takes way too long. I submit a plan and it takes weeks, sometimes months. I don't understand why. And so that delays what we want to do. We're still doing something, but everything that we wanted to do, it delays it. So then it puts us behind our recruiting, and it makes it look like we're not doing what we need to do. So I'm not sure, I would say if that process could be improved with sponsors, CROs, more communication, especially when they have a dedicated recruitment team at the CRO sponsor. I'm not sure why it's taking that long. So that's one of the things I've noticed that's been happening a lot lately on the studies I'm on.
All of you are obviously great resources in your communities for helping them learn more about clinical trials and clinical research. But what are some resources that sponsors could tap into to learn more about your individual communities and how they can begin making everything a bit more inclusive? I know, Judy, you mentioned before making sure things are translated, and Dr. Henderson, you mentioned culturally that there are certain traditions that people have that would prohibit them from doing certain tests or procedures and things like that. What are some resources that they could tap into as the FDA guidance is coming and as they're looking to make things more inclusive? What are some things that they can do to educate themselves on how to actually make these, how to get rid of their own biases and barriers?
I wanted to go back to it's the sites. I mean, I think they really need to connect more with the sites. These are conversations we're not having with sponsor CROs, and I feel like they're going around other ways trying to figure this out, and it may be more costly or complicated ways when they can just go to the sites directly and find out more, have a conversation with them, maybe get them part of that conversation from the beginning when it comes to creating the protocol, these materials, whatever the study design, so they could be more effective and not waste so much time in the long term with protocol amendments and things that occur. And I don't see a lot of sponsor CROs doing that yet. I don't know if that happens in other therapeutic areas. And I just feel like if there was more, there's like a gap between the sites, sponsor CROs, when it comes to having them be part of that conversation.
completely agree with you, Judy. To your point, I'm glad you went ahead and went first, because I was basically going to say the same thing. And this rolls back into how much, honestly, representation matters. And sending folks out who have some of the same disparities, or face some of the same disparities, going out into the community at those sites and just having a conversation, right, with the sites. Clear and concise messaging, information, so that you can have an educated conversation. But again, you have to start with the trust. So I think, to a portion of your question, Michael, how do you build that trust? One, being honest that there's an issue. And that may be why, Judy, some of these CROs they struggle so much with a more grassroots, for lack of a better word, grassroots approach, because they have not yet admitted to themselves that there's even an issue. So I think that's number one. They have to go back to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, be honest, there's an issue here, and then start the groundwork for getting past some of those issues.
Are there any recent improvements that you have seen from the industry that have had a positive impact on your ability to enroll more diverse patients in clinical trials, clinical research?
I would have to say there are a few sponsors and CROs who have been very open, or very they have this DEI already in place at their company, and they've reached out to our site, and see how we can connect with them more, collaborate, maybe have these conversations. We were saying that internally, there's been a few, so I've seen that positive change the past couple years, but other than that, I mean, I don't see, I hear a lot of all these companies that are very open and willing to do anything, but I have not heard from a lot of those sponsor CROs contact me directly to see how they can get their clinical trials in my community. So I'm not sure where they're exactly going if I have 75% Latinos. So I think there's some kind of gap there too as well. And hey, my site's here. I'm willing to have these conversations with every sponsor CRO. Anything I can do to help them succeed, that's what I want to do. I'm just not getting approached by everyone who is saying they're doing something in the industry.
That's definitely an issue, or shall I say concern. Ever since I know, speaking specifically for the Black community, ever since George Floyd's murder, DEI has been a buzzword. But it's been just that in a lot of instances, a buzzword or buzz phrase. I believe, again, attacking some of the systemic issues within these organizations is where it starts. You have to have representation. You have to have seats at every table. That includes leadership, because diverse perspectives is good science, and good science equates good business. It's a win-win for everybody. So I think continuing to be honest. You do see more CROs and sponsors, sharing their metrics. Hey, we have a problem here. And then keeping the community as well as the employees informed of the progress of those metrics. And again, bringing on board different diverse perspectives. And I'm not just advocating for, double minorities such as myself, but again, that's one of the reasons why I love my my CRO, because there are such a wide range of employee resource groups that are helping to, promote folks, empower them to share their innovations and perspectives. And because everyone doesn't want to be the CEO of a company, and that's fine, but you can absolutely be impactful in your own lane. And so, yeah, I think, again, continuing to be honest that there's an issue and holding yourself accountable by sharing that issue with the masses.
I cannot say that we've yet seen any innovations from our CROs or sponsors. But it's certainly true that success can breed success. Our very first vaccine trial, which was a placebo-controlled COVID-19 vaccine trial, we were very late added as the 24th US site for this. Almost everyone else was a tier 1 academic institution. While, I guess, like I said initially, we're a independent, tax-exempt, community-based trial site. But we amazed the sponsor by being the only US site to reach its 40 participant enrollment cap. And that caught the sponsor's attention, and they immediately asked us to participate in their COVID-19 booster vaccine trial, where we also did a really good job. So, I really, I mentioned we started with the COVID Prevention Network, which we didn't find any success with the trials they were conducting. And so before we went under, we finally found a sponsor to take a chance on us, and it's worked out really, really pretty well. And we're grateful for that. Something else said previously, we're really benefited from having trial site staff who know this community really well, who move about the community and live in the community really well. Perhaps we'll talk more about our efforts to enroll marginalized populations, but in our case, that means that at least once a week, a pair of my staff head out into the community to the last physical address known for some of our participants, or to walk along the river that flows in Rapid City, because they just might find some of our trial participants who are unhoused, and they know the favored locations underneath bridges and stuff for some of our participants. That has really been a boon to our efforts, even if at times it has caused a lot of indigestion for our CROs, and in a case or two, the sponsor.
Feel like there
Michael, I'm sorry.
is
I wanted to add something else if it was okay. From the site perspective, I wanted to mention why it's extremely important what we just spoke about, because I still to this day will have conversations with recruitment people who are higher up, and they have no clue why we need to do what we're doing. They have no clue what it's like to recruit in a diverse community or minority community. And yet they're the person responsible for approving recruitment plans, for providing funds. So that's one of the barriers I've encountered a lot, and we need to change it. That's why it is extremely important to have a diverse group of people working at all levels in all organizations, because we have the different perspectives, people from our community who will understand when you see a recruitment plan. Okay, I know exactly what they're talking about, and I know exactly what they're going to be doing, because I think there's a lot of people in these positions that don't understand exactly all the work that goes into it.
carrying off that point and some of the things that we've been talking about throughout the discussion. We started with asking why diversity in clinical trials is important for our individual communities. But how would you describe why it's important for sponsors, why it's critically important for sponsors that they begin doing this work, and not just because of the FDA guidelines, but overall as an industry and for society as a whole? Why do you feel like it's important that this be undertaken?
The truth of the matter is, Michael, everyone's not going to do it because it's the right thing to do. That is the main reason. But I mentioned something earlier that I really feel is true. Diverse perspectives is good science, and good science is good business. So even if that's your main reason, it's still a valid reason. And I really, wish that CROs and sponsors would focus on progress over perfection. These are systemic issues that are not going to be resolved overnight. So sitting back, doing nothing, trying to devise a plan to do what's perfect is going to get you moving nowhere. So do something. Pick one of these areas of improvement and focus on that so that you can start to have some progress. And as Jeff said, Judy said, I said with my sugar honey iced tea example, success begets success. So start somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's another thing we didn't really talk about is the image that sponsors have in these communities. We didn't tap too much into that. There's still a lot of patients who don't trust pharma companies. Pharma companies haven't done that great of a job of sharing information out there in the community, whether it's TV or flyers. There's a little bit more of it that I've seen, but not that much. And still, people are still not trusting. So if there's some way they can improve that, change it, put more content out there, just as much as they spend on ads for medications that are FDA approved, they should spend that much about clinical trials and diversity. I think that would make a huge difference, get people more comfortable, aside from, what the site level is doing.
Agreed. Awareness is key. Awareness is key. Absolutely.
As we're beginning to run close to time, I just wanted to give everyone just a few minutes if there's anything that you feel like is important to this discussion that we haven't covered, that you feel like would be important for sponsors or CROs or even other sites to know. Just give you the opportunity to share that content.
I can share about that topic, and the topic here is the increasing push for decentralized clinical trials. I've already said that we focus on really trying to enroll our most marginalized residents, many of which just happen to be my relatives, to be Lakota Sioux, but others. And what that means is probably only 1/3 of our 210 vaccine trial participants own a smartphone. They own so-called feature phones, which are just flip phones that can't even text. And they may be minute phones on top of that. When you're that marginalized, when you're that socioeconomically depressed, you may run out of, I know for a fact they do, run out of minutes halfway through a month on their phone. They may lose their number as a result and have to go to Walmart and pick up another feature phone, or, they have to wait till they can reload their minutes on their phone to reactivate it. When you're that economically depressed, and you're moving about in the community, anything you have of value is at risk of being stolen. And so we have multiple examples of the electronic diaries, the iPhone 6s that we've given our participants for our vaccine trials. They've been stolen, broken, involved in crashes. What's even what's really quite crazy about that is on 2 of these trials, the weekly electronic diary only asks 2 simple questions. Have you had a change in your health status since you last did this diary a week ago? And have you been exposed to, pick your topic, RSV or influenza or COVID-19? It's just 2 questions if you're feeling fine and you have nothing to report. Several of our participants have 0% completion of their electronic diaries after a year. They're just not going to do them. They're just not on board with them. It's just not going to work. But they're here on time for every single on-site visit. We can reach them every single week, but we don't have any way to make up for their missing e-diary entries. I mean, we can document it in the progress notes, but we can't fill it in and rave for them. So, so there are some things that sponsors do that really, really can get in the way of the successful participation of really marginalized trial participants. So, one of our trials did use a paper diary, fortunately, and they did keep up with documenting things on a paper diary to a really good extent. So I guess, that's one of the lessons we're learning is in future trials that want to push an electronic diary on us, I'm going to ask that they also make a paper diary available because that will be less threatening and more easy to maintain by the trial participants that we typically have in our trials.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. We have something similar with electronic stuff. Some of these communities, the technology doesn't always work well. There could be issues with internet, so that's something that sponsors and CROs need to understand. And not all tech is good tech. So, as Dr. Henderson mentioned, if it's just easier for participants to fill a paper diary or paper log, that might be best in the situation for a specific study instead of a diary. Sometimes they don't upload depending where the patient's at. But the other thing, aside from the tech issue, is that it's not the GCT component is not ideal for every trial or every condition. So I think sponsors and CROs should be more flexible with their protocol design, the vendors they're using, what they're implementing. And I think a hybrid approach, I've seen a lot of protocols that we've been on has been a good approach. It seems to work well for a lot of studies, but 100% tech doesn't work well in our community. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I know we talked a lot about this, is there's a lot of players in this industry, right, working on clinical trials. And I think we need to have a more collaborative approach of working with each other. And there's a lot of gaps in between. So I think if sponsors and CROs can take a look at all the players that are working on that clinical trial, and how do you bring everyone together to be on the same page, to communicate, collaborate, that would make for a very successful clinical trial.
And in closing, I'll just say to both Judy and Jeff's points, I'm a project manager by trade, so I understand the importance of the planning stage of a project. That being said, I think consideration from the beginning would alleviate as many amendments as there are to protocols and things of that nature. So considering the entire patient, the community that you're attempting to seek patient participation in, considering them in their entirety and not just what you need from them for this clinical trial participation, not just looking at your metrics and things of that nature, but considering the whole person from the very beginning in your planning process, in writing the protocols, I think that is where there needs to be a shift, because if that is done, everything else we touched on would be considered. How we're educating the community before we start the trial. You know, how are we building relationships with the community before we start the trial? If that is taken into consideration from the very beginning, we would have a lot more participation and trials will go a lot smoother.
This has been an absolutely phenomenal conversation. I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for being here and participating in it, and for sharing your experiences and your feedback, and for trying to push this narrative and, the significance of this forward, both, on an institutional level, but also on a community level. This continues to be very important. And as someone who also works in the space, who does a lot of research regarding the challenges and barriers that communities of color and patients of color face in regards to not only clinical trial participation, but their own disease treatment progression, I understand very well how important this is. On an overall big picture level. And especially as, an African American male, someone who has nieces and nephews and, you know, grandparents and godkids who, have a variety of conditions from asthma to diabetes to obesity and things like that. Um, we know how important it is that there is adequate treatment and options available for them so that we can also live, a full, healthy, and successful life. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for the work that you do. Thank you again for being here. And I hope that we can continue connecting in the future to continue promoting this discussion.
Thank
for
you,
having us.
Michael. It's
Thank
been an
you,
honor
Michael.
to be on the panel with you, Judy and Jeff.
Same here.
Likewise, an honor to be with both of you.
Yes.